Hello everybody, and today on the channel we're going to be doing something a little differently. So today I'm going to be presenting a little bit of a deep dive. I know most of you haven't seen my face before, but I'm Seki. I usually do all of the editing and that sort of stuff. I'm the one who puts in the little jokes and the images. That's what I do on this channel. But today is kind of going to be the start of some new content that I want to start producing, so let's get into it. As you can see beside me, I have two books up on this table. The first is the first volume of the 86 light novel. Now, some of you may know, this being an anime channel, that we watch a lot of anime here, and 86 is an anime that has recently come out and is currently in the process of its second season coming out. Although by the time this video goes up, the second season will be over. However, because of second season spoilers, the fact that I filmed this video before the second season finished, we're not going to be talking about the second season in today's video. So we're going to be talking about just season 1 of the anime 86. The other book I have over here is the novel-length version of Nightfall by Isaac Asimov and Robert Silverberg. Now, the reason this has two authors is because this is actually a full-length novel that's based on a short story that was written by Isaac Asimov. Now, some of you may be wondering what these works have to do with one another, and the reason for that is that I'm a college student, and this semester I've been taking a fascinating class called English Literature of Science Fiction and Fantasy, and in it we've basically covered a book-by-book history of the science fiction genre. And for my final project, I've decided that I want to talk about a very specific trope, Dark Night of the Soul, and then I want to talk about it in relation to one of the works that we read in class, Nightfall, which I personally loved, and in terms of a work that I have recently experienced on my own. Now, on the channel, an 86 review will be going up the same week that this video is put out, and I'd appreciate it if you could go over and give those some views. But today we'll be talking about specifically the characters and how they deal with Dark Night of the Soul. And so to start off, we're going to talk about what Dark Night of the Soul is as a trope in books that you can read. Theoretically, it's a concept that says that every person will face a spiritual crisis. During this time, they can go through depression, anxiety, a sense of loss, emptiness, and they mentally and or physically struggle with this spiritual crisis that they're having. And in some way, we will come out on the other side. We may not come out on the other side in a good way, we may come out in a bad way, and some people fail to come out entirely, and they get stuck in this dark night of their soul, and they're unable to break free of it. Typically, if you break free of it in a good way, you get a sense of euphoria, peace, completeness, all those kind of good serotonin happy emotions. The same things you get when you see, like, a nicely organized room, or you do something right the first time, and you're just like, oh, that's amazing, I feel so good about myself. So, I personally think it's a very common motif, and I've seen it in a lot of the other works we've read in this class. I know in Journey to the Center of the Earth, which was one of the first books we read, Jules Verne does a lot with the Dark Night of the Soul and the main characters. Now, I chose Nightfall, though, because in Nightfall there's examples of Dark Night of the Soul applying to both individual people and societies. So, the general premise of Dark Night of the Soul, spoilers ahead for both 86 and the short story Nightfall, is that they're on a planet that has not experienced darkness in recorded history that they know of, other than some vague texts from religious groups. And they know that the planet is going to go dark. The suns are going to go down. There will no longer be light shining on the planet. And there's different people who take this in different sorts of ways. There are fanatics who firmly believe that the world is going to end and that society is going to be destroyed. There are scientists who want to study what's happening and don't think that anything bad is going to happen other than what the cultists or the fanatics or the heretics, whatever you want to call them, the religious group in the book, is inciting in the populace. And the short story is based on a prompt that was given to Asimov at one point. If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God? And essentially that's the difference between the characters in Nightfall, is you have the fanatics and the heretics who have religious texts, as they call them, that were written by people who might have experienced the last darkness event. And then you have the scientists who don't acknowledge these texts because they're considered to be religious nonsense. And so you have different characters experiencing this impending darkness in different ways. And in the short story, at the end of it, I mean, obviously it's a short story, it's not fully fleshed out, but at the end of it, it's essentially alluded to that the cities begin to burn. People go absolutely wild. They just cannot cope with this darkness. Society becomes lawless, and civilization starts to burn. And there are some characters who see the darkness and they accept it, and they still kind of come out on the other side changed. And that's the whole point. There are characters who come out of this revelation of darkness going, I wonder what's going to happen next, right? They've conquered their fears and they're looking towards the future. And then there are characters who are dissolving into chaos, anarchy, panic, distress, depression, all that kind of stuff. So there's good examples for both individual characters and society in Nightfall. And I personally think that 86 is a work that has a lot of examples of people from different walks of life and different situations going through a Dark Night of the Soul event and coming through on the other side or not coming through, as the case may be. Now, normally in these videos, I would use imagery and I would show you screenshots from the anime or from the manga or that sort of thing, but as some of you may have heard, if you're on AniTube, there's recently an issue going around with video and image copyright and large-scale channel striking, and I do not want to put the channel at risk for that. So we're not going to be showing any specific animation or anything, but when I'm talking about a specific character, I will try to put their face here on the screen so that I can tell you about them. And that way you can see what they look like, maybe some basic stats if I have the basic information about them. So, because there's some other videos coming out on the channel, I'm not going to cover the general plot and setup of the show. We're just going to cover a lot of spoilers about individual characters and such. So I want to start with first two members of the Republic of San Magnolia that I think are really important in the general scope of looking at a Dark Night of the Soul trope in the first season of the 86 anime. This includes, of course, the books which I've read, but we're going to be talking about the anime primarily because it's easier for most people to get access to. So the first person I want to talk about is Vladilena Mills, right? She is the female protagonist of this anime. So a lot of this anime centers on her, and a lot centers on a bunch of characters that I'm going to get to after I talk about the people from the Republic. Basically, she's a military commander. She's the handler of this group of people. And she's worked all her life to become a handler of this group of people. And what's basically happening in her life is that she's become a handler, and according to the Republic that she works for, the people that she's handling aren't human. They're just assets fighting on the front lines of a war that we don't learn much about. She herself has some very progressive social opinions, especially at the beginning of the show. She feels that the people that she's in charge of are humans and that they should be given a lot of the same rights as humans. And she often feels very upset when her superiors refuse to help her to help them. So before the story takes place, we learn that she's very good at doing her job, and she's very good at being the handler of these legions that are fighting on the front lines. And by handler, she basically sits in a command room connected to these units, and she's essentially helping them conduct military operations against their opposing force. In a way, a lot of Vladilena's struggle is related to a Dark Night of the Soul. The fact that she considers these people that she's commanding to be just as human as everyone else has her in a severe crisis at all times, because very often people under her command die, and she doesn't know these people beyond when she interacts with them for missions, but she forms bonds with a lot of the main characters that we'll be talking about later, so whenever one of them dies, it hits her very deeply. And it's often that there's nothing that she can do to stop it. And a lot of these other characters, they resent her in a lot of ways because she's part of this republic that's forcing them to fight. A lot of them think of her as kind of a sympathetic idiot. They think that she's pitying them, but she can't really change anything, so why should she pity them, is how they feel. And unfortunately, she has to sit there in the chair watching these characters die, one after another. But even through all this, going through the anime, leading up to what I consider to be her true time of spiritual crisis, she maintains a strong sense of self. She wants to help these people. She actively wants to befriend them. She wants them to ask her when they need help. And that's one of the strongest parts about her character, is that even though she knows that these things are happening, these atrocities are being committed, all she wants to do is genuinely help however she can. However, at the end of the anime, the group that she is leading is sent on a suicide mission that will take them completely out of range, so she will no longer be able to talk to them, they will no longer be able to communicate with her, and essentially they will be considered dead. And for her, this is a breaking moment. She goes a little bit wild right before this, and she essentially hacks into several military mainframes in order to deliver this massive payload of weapons to save them right before they go out of range, so that she doesn't have to hear them die, and so that she knows that they'll at least still be living when they go out of range of the sensors that she uses to communicate with them. However, after this happens, she's essentially put on forced leave from her military position, and she takes a trip out to the facility where these people were working near the front lines. And she goes through this facility which has been emptied, cleared out of every remnant of these people that over the course of this story she's become so connected with, despite not knowing what they look like and not knowing who they are. All she does is hear their voices, but she hears them and talks to them often in their weakest or deepest moments, or on moments when they're intensely stressed, so she's formed an emotional connection with these characters. And she goes to this place that should have remnants of their being alive and their having existed, and there isn't any other than a photo that one of them has left for her of the entire squadron, with each of their names labeled for her to see which one is which and what they look like, and this drawing that they made of her when she first started serving as their commander. And up till this point, she's lost in despair. These people have gone off on a suicide mission. No one will believe her. She genuinely thinks that the Empire, the Republic, is failing them, and that she's somehow failing them by being unable to change the point of view of the Empire, and she's ready to give up until she sees these remnants, and she knows that they survived to go outside sentry range, and so she gathers up her strength, and in my opinion, overcomes her spiritual crisis, because we see her on the train tracks where they left. We see her facing in the direction they went, and rather than follow after them, she turns around. She takes their picture and she turns around and she goes back to her job, because she's going to now do everything in her power to change the way this system works. She's not going to let this happen again if she can possibly help it. This is how she comes through. She doubles down. All of her loss and her emptiness from not having them, she takes that, and she is now, at the end of the anime season 1, channeling that into making a difference, more so than just sitting in a chair and talking to them while they're on missions. The other character from the Republic I'd like to talk about is a woman named Annette. Now, Annette is Vladilena's only friend throughout the entire anime. Annette is a researcher. She works a lot, and she also works for the Republic and the military, like Vladilena does. However, Annette is different, because Vladilena has never really had experience with these people that she's been talking to before the end of the anime, when she has her spiritual journey. Annette knew these people when she was children, and Annette has always felt regret and hopelessness for not being able to stand up or do anything when she was a child, and when these people were taken and turned into weapons for the Republic. And so in a lot of ways, Annette doesn't have her dark night of the soul during the story at all. But Annette is a result of falling during her dark night of the soul. She feels intense depression, loss, guilt, and she never comes through it on the other side to be a stronger person. She consistently feels hopeless and powerless and genuinely does not think that she could have done anything to help, and she does not see a way to help these people going forward. In no way does she see a way for her to make up for what she's done. At one point in the story, she does help Vladilena hack into the military and help them, but it doesn't change her opinion. She is so deeply held in depression and guilt that she is unable to overcome it and make a difference. And so between these two people, we have examples of two people who are in the Republic who are supposed to believe that this other group of people are below them, who are supposed to believe that they're inhuman, and neither of them do, but one of them takes all of her depression and realizations and lets it drown her, and the other one takes it and turns it into fuel for change, the change that she wants to affect in the world. So I've been mentioning a lot of like this other character group over the course of Vladilena and Henrietta's stories with their crises. So this other group of people are called the 86ers. The briefest overview that I can give is that basically the 86 is what the people from the Republic call a race of people called the Colorata, who were persecuted and exiled and forced into this 86th sector of the Empire, and essentially forced to be the on-ground frontline troops in a fight against another empire. Textbooks often describe them as inhuman and similar to pigs, even though they bear all the resemblances and intelligence of a human. It's basically a case of racism. Very clean-cut, and very brutal. The 86ers I'd like to cover today are specifically the Spearhead Squadron, and we're not going to be talking about everyone from the Spearhead Squadron, because that's far too many people. The Spearhead Squadron is not one group of people statically. It's something that people come in and out of, but essentially what it is, to preface the list of characters that I'll be going into next, is it's a suicide squad. The 86ers are promised that if they serve a certain amount of military service, they will be allowed rights and to be citizens of the Republic of Magnolia once again when they successfully finish their military service. However, anyone who gets to the last year of their military term is sent to the Spearhead Squadron, which is a suicide squad where the idea is for them to be killed in frontline fighting, or at the end of this season 1, or at the end of this part of the story, to be sent off on a suicide scouting mission. Now, it's not explicitly stated that this is a suicide mission, but it's something that all of the characters know. It's unspoken, but everyone knows it. In this video, we're obviously going to be talking about the 86ers that we follow in the first season of the anime, Shin's generation, and Shin's going to be the first character that we talk about. Shin, or Shine no Zen, is the male protagonist of this entire anime. He is the leader of the Spearhead Squadron under the personal name Undertaker. He is known as the Reaper of the battlefield, hence the name Undertaker. He has a special ability that allows him to hear the voices of the opposing force in his head, and therefore he can locate them without having to rely on the military location, radar, and homing. Now, my interpretation that I want to bring through in this analysis, right, is that the dark night of the soul that each of these characters is going through is their military enlistment and their transfer to the Spearhead Squadron. Their spiritual crisis, right, is the fact that they know going into this that they are being moved to a suicide squad where essentially the goal is for them to die. No one has ever gotten out that they know. Now, what I want to talk about in regards to Dark Night of the Soul, because by that definition it would seem like I wouldn't have much to talk about, is how each of them behaves going through this, through the anime that we see. Because each of them have very different ways of coping with this and dealing with the idea that they are all going to die, pretty much. So, Shin is generally a pretty kind person. However, Shin has one of the hardest roles in the anime, especially for his internal spiritual crisis. Because as the leader, it's his job to make sure that his men cannot be taken by the Empire and used by them. So he's not only the leader of the squad, he's also their executioner. And because he's the leader and he has some telepathic abilities and connections, essentially, not only does he hear other members of his squad die every time they die, if they don't die immediately in battle, he's the one who has to go and execute them. And this is something that he's had to come to terms with over the course of all of the story before the anime even starts. In the anime, this is something that he's already used to, unfortunately. Now, essentially, the vibe we get from him through the beginning of the anime is that he doesn't have a lot of care for his own life beyond being able to use it to protect the other members of his squad. And I think here we have an example of a manifestation that Shin doesn't care whether he lives or dies. He did not come through this realization that he was being put on a suicide mission with any sort of good emotions coming from it. He knows that he's going to die, but he wants to make sure that he is going to die in a way that saves as many of his comrades as is humanly possible. And in the end, when they go off on the suicide mission, that's what he tries to do. He tries to sacrifice himself to let his companions escape. And in that way, I don't think that Shin really made it through his dark night of the soul. And of course, his is integrally tied with the last character that we're going to talk about. And I don't want to talk about that quite yet. So we're going to move on from Shin for now. We're going to talk about his second in command, Raiden, whose personal name is Werewolf. He's the vice captain of the Spearhead unit. And his name is actually a reflection of the fact that he is a quite snappish and hot-tempered person. And his way of reacting to this revelation that they're on a suicide squad is that he makes sure everyone's all right. He, I think, does not succumb so strongly to depression and doubt and the realization that he's going to die as Shin does. He's always constantly hopeful, and he tries to take care of absolutely everyone. And he's always the first to tell people that their ideas are stupid when they are. I think in a lot of ways Raiden still holds hope throughout the story that they're going to come through this on the other side. But it's almost a fool's hope. Oftentimes when you see him in the story, it seems like he knows that he's going to die, but he refuses to admit it and instead insists that they're going to make it through. The next two characters I'm going to talk about are virtually inseparable. They're Daiya, or Black Dog, and Anju, also known as Snow Witch. And very specifically, I wanted to include these two because of all the characters, they're the most codependent. They serve together and they're constantly seen together, and they do have a kind of romance thing going on, which seems to fuel both of them into insisting that everything's going to be all right and that they're going to get out and be able to live a nice life together in the end. However, partway through the story, Daiya dies. And because of this, Anju goes through a complete change in a lot of her personality in the series. She goes through her spiritual awakening, I think, when she finally sees Daiya as dead, and she knows that what she and Daiya had kind of always dreamed about, never spoken, because if you speak it out loud, it wouldn't really happen, but whatever their dreams were for after their military service and getting out of this in the end, finally dies. When she and the remaining members of the Spearhead Squadron are sent off on their suicide scouting mission, essentially the end of their careers, she manifests this intense sense of hopelessness when she's the one who volunteers to stay behind and be killed for everyone else to move ahead. And she was willing to do almost anything to achieve this. Now, I'm not going to go over every 86er. I'm just going to cover these characters so far. And part of the reason for that is that I think all of the 86ers go through relatively similar realizations. It's hard for a group of people who have lived together for so long and worked together and are all aware that they're on a suicide squadron to have incredibly vastly different perceptions. But what I wanted to show by talking about these characters was that there are different manifestations, and even though they all know they're going to die, some of them accept it and become incredibly protective of the other members as if there's something they could do to save the other members, and some of them fall to it, some of them become depressed and reckless, and some cling to hope, like they genuinely think that in the end they're going to get out of this. And I think one of the big things about Dark Night of the Soul is that it doesn't necessarily mean that when you come out on the other side, you're going to be good or you're not going to come out at all. I think the journey itself has more to do with your attitude and how you're behaving and the way that you're accepting life. Obviously, it can be a more physical thing where you could go through a spiritual crisis and then not come out physically. Maybe you die, something happens. But I think in the case of the 86ers, it's their spirits, it's their hopes and dreams that are dying in their spiritual crises. It's the characters who maintain hope and think that they're going to get out of this, or think that they can somehow still change their circumstances, and the characters who absolutely don't believe that they can change their circumstances anymore. And that seems to make all the difference to me when reading this trope, is it's never physically whether someone comes out of a Dark Night of the Soul good or bad, because you can fail and still come out of a Dark Night of the Soul type situation. And at the same time, you can have your spiritual crisis and succeed and still end up dead. I think to me, it's how you see it portrayed in a story and how all the different people can react in such massively different ways that makes it an incredibly interesting thing to read. Especially in the context of 86, when you have a preset spiritual crisis applied to every single character in this one group in the main cast, all of these 86ers. What would you do if you know you were being sent on a suicide mission? How would that affect you? How would you come through that on the other side? What would your mentality change to be? That's what's important here. And then the final character I want to cover is somewhat interesting. So I said that Shin's story was a little bit more involved, and it is. And the reason for that is because Shin had a brother named Shourei, and Shourei was also an 86er, and he was also a part of the Spearhead Squadron. And at the beginning of the story, Shourei isn't around. He's deceased. That's what everyone is told. That's what we all assume. And I haven't really talked about the enemy they're fighting either, and that's because their enemy aren't other humans. So their enemy are these mechs. They're like mechanized attackers. Everyone's fighting essentially in these suits. There'll be some schematics on screen, but everyone's fighting in these suits, but their attackers are from the T.H.E Empire. And what the T.H.E Empire did a long time ago when this war started was it took its people and it would put their brains into these bots, mechs, whatever you want to call them, processors, and essentially their brains would fuel these things to move forward, which is why Shin has to completely execute any members of his group that fall. He wants to prevent them from being used to fuel one of these processors that will then be turned on their former comrades, because what they do is they take the heads and they install them into these units, and then these units become Legion, the Legion that they are fighting. And Shin's brother is known as Dullahan. And for those of you who have any familiarity with mythology in any way relatively related to Europe and the Celtic Isles, a Dullahan is a headless rider. And it's really fitting for him because Shin's older brother was captured by Legion. They took his head and they installed it as a shepherd, one of the leaders of this Legion that they're fighting. And Shin's story throughout the anime is him tracking down his brother. He wants to find his brother's head and be done with it. Like, he wants to put his brother to rest, because the problem is when these heads are installed in these processors, these brains, sometimes it traps their last thoughts or their last wishes, and he can hear them in his head. He can hear them crying and screaming for freedom, for loved ones to be let out, to kill. They're driven crazy, and he can hear all of that, and he can hear his brother who's coming for him. And I wanted to talk about Shourei because Shourei is a shepherd, so he has some level of sentience still. He's one of the leaders of the Legion, so he's not just a foot soldier. His brain still has some level of sentience, and he wants to capture Shin and turn him into a shepherd also, so that they can be together forever, and he can protect him forever. Shourei did go through the crisis of being told that he was put on a suicide squad. He was on a suicide squad. He was on suicide missions. And then he was captured and essentially tortured and forced to fight the people that he once fought alongside, including his little brother. And his mind breaks. He thinks that turning his brother into something like him is going to fix it. It's going to make it so that they can always be together. And it's such an amazing showdown between them, because in the end, Shourei breaks out of it. A moment of clarity comes over him, and he hesitates for just that second it takes for Shin to get away, for Shin to win. And that's such an amazing character arc for him, because he's already faced a dark night of the soul, and he failed. He didn't come through it. I mean, he's been driven mad. Obviously not by his own choices, but he's been driven mad. And then he comes through at the very end, at a point where he's almost at the point of no return. He's going to kill his little brother and turn him into one of them. And he has a moment of clarity. It just hits him for a moment. And Shin wins. And Shin goes on. And Shourei's put to rest. And I think Shourei is such an amazing example of being able to come through Dark Night of the Soul in such a strong cinematic way. It was a beautiful moment in the anime. If I could show the clip on screen, I absolutely would. And it's made all the more poignant by the fact that going through the anime, we see that internally, Shourei had always blamed Shin, his little brother, subconsciously for their parents being caught and put in the internment camps. So he wanted to protect his brother, but he also blamed him all his life, and then he was sent on suicide missions. He was captured, essentially captured by the enemy, tortured into fighting the people that he once fought with. And in the end, he still regrets his actions. So those are all the characters I wanted to cover in today's video. And I know it's going to be a little bit of a long video, and you may not have sat through it the whole way, but I think that across this set of characters you can really see a lot of different ways that Dark Night of the Soul can go, and ways that human characters can interact with the idea of a spiritual crisis and let it consume them, or fight through it, or kind of end up in like a weird half and half zone where it's not fully consuming them, but they're not really free of the crisis they're going through. And for me, tropes are all about seeing how they can be done differently in different works across different characters. That's often why seeing characters who are foils of one another is really, really interesting. So I highly recommend anyone watching. Nightfall is an amazing short story. You don't have to read the full-length novel, but the short story is absolutely fantastic. And honestly, I think that 86, the anime, season 1, is an amazing case study of looking at people going through spiritual crises and how they come out on the other side and how their mental states change and evolve. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Please like, comment, subscribe, go interact with some of our other videos. We have a lot of different content on the channel this year, and we're going to be adding a lot more in the future. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas, and I hope you have a Happy New Year.